What happens when a woman, labeled too old to be loved, boards a flight home after being rejected by the man who promised her a new beginning, and ends up sitting beside a single father who's lost all faith in second chances? This isn't just a love story. It's a quiet miracle at 30,000 feet. A moment where two broken hearts collide, not in drama, but in kindness. And what follows might just change how you see love forever. If stories of hope, healing, and unexpected grace speak to you, take a moment to subscribe to Soul Moments Story, where every video is crafted to warm your heart and remind you it's never too late to be seen. Now, let's begin. The house was too quiet. Not the comforting quiet of a Sunday morning, with birds outside the window and the kettle hissing softly in the kitchen. No, this was the stillness that settled in after grief had unpacked its bags and made itself at home. The kind of silence that seemed to echo, no matter how softly Susan Bennett walked through the hallway. It had been 6 weeks since George's funeral, 10 years since his diagnosis, 34 since she had first taken his hand under the willow tree by the lake in Vermont. A lifetime of moments, reduced now to 2 boxes of belongings, a headstone, and memories that played like worn-out reels behind her eyes. She stood in the doorway of the study, looking at the leather armchair where he used to sit. His reading glasses still rested on the side table, as if waiting for the morning newspaper he would never read again. Susan walked in slowly, her slippers brushing the hardwood. The air smelled faintly of old books and lavender. She reached for the drawer beneath the writing desk, pulling it open with the same hesitation one might have when lifting a bandage, afraid of what healing might reveal. There it was. The notebook, tattered at the edges, the corners curled like leaves in autumn. On the front, in George's scrawled handwriting from decades ago, it read, "Things we'll do someday." It was a journal they started when they first married, back when everything seemed possible, before careers, children, illness, before time had started taking more than it gave. She sat down and opened to the first page. Her fingers trembled slightly as she read the list. See the tulip fields in the Netherlands. Take a road trip down Route 66. Learn to dance without stepping on each other. Grow old together, but never stop dating. Susan's lips curved upward, gently. Bittersweet. They'd done a few of those things. Others had fallen by the wayside, buried under mortgage payments, school drop-offs, and medical bills. She flipped further ahead. Near the back was a list written in her own hand. It wasn't part of the we. It was titled, "Things I Never Got to Do." There were only 5 bullet points. Ride in a hot air balloon, sing at an open mic, spend Christmas in a cabin, visit Scotland, fall in love again. That last line hit her harder than she expected. She stared at it for a long moment. Not because she felt ready for love. No, but because she finally admitted, deep inside, that she didn't want to be invisible anymore. She didn't want to be just the widow, or the nice old lady who volunteers at the library. She wanted someone to see her, really see her, laugh with her, ask her how she takes her tea and remember it. But who would want a 56-year-old woman with wrinkles around her eyes and decades of quiet disappointments behind her? Still, her hand moved instinctively. She opened her laptop. The glow of the screen filled the study with new light. Tentatively, she searched for a website she'd only ever heard whispers about from a friend who'd once found love again. Mail-order matchmaking for mature companionship. She scoffed softly. "Ridiculous," she whispered. "Desperate." But still, she clicked. Her profile was simple. Widowed, former music teacher, lives in Vermont, loves baking, long walks, and believes kindness still matters. She didn't lie about her age. She uploaded a recent picture, the one where her silver-streaked hair was pulled into a soft bun and she was holding a cup of cider at the farmer's market. She was about to close the browser when a message pinged. Name: Gerald M. Age: 62. Location: Arizona. Message: You seem like someone who remembers how to laugh. I'd like to talk more. Susan blinked. Her heart did something strange. Fluttered, maybe. Or trembled. It had been so long since she'd felt anything that wasn't grief, fatigue, or politeness. They exchanged messages over the next week. Gerald was kind. A widower, like her. A quiet man who worked in furniture restoration. He loved poetry. Had a rescued Labrador named Quincy. And he'd never been to New England, but said he always imagined it smelled like cinnamon and firewood. When he asked if she'd be willing to visit, she hesitated. Not out of fear, but out of disbelief. Was this really happening? She booked a one-way flight to Arizona. Just one small suitcase, a few modest outfits, and a dress, blue with little white flowers, that she hadn't worn in years. The morning of her departure, Susan stood in front of the mirror. She pinned her hair the way George used to like, then paused, her eyes meeting her own in the glass. "You are not too old," she whispered. "You are not done." She took the notebook from the study and slipped it into her purse. As the cab waited outside, she glanced back at the house one last time. Not with sorrow, this time with something closer to hope. Susan Bennett, 56, boarded a plane headed west. Not for a man, not for a fairy tale, but for one simple, aching truth. She wasn't finished yet. The airport was loud in a way Susan hadn't anticipated. It wasn't just the whir of luggage wheels or the tinny voices over the PA system announcing departures. It was the energy, chaotic, restless, like the pulse of people chasing somewhere to belong. She stood still for a moment in the check-in area, clutching the handle of her modest suitcase. It was a navy blue roller bag with a loose zipper and a small bow tied to the top. Something she'd added years ago, back when George was still able to recognize colors, and she needed a way to distinguish their luggage in the crowd. The dress inside, a soft blue fabric speckled with tiny white flowers, lay carefully folded beside her notebook. She hadn't brought much else, just enough for a long weekend, just enough to believe in possibility without committing to disappointment. She handed over her boarding pass with a polite smile to the gate agent, who barely glanced up before waving her through. Susan was used to not being noticed, but something about today, the act of stepping onto a plane with a heart both trembling and expectant, made her wish someone would look at her and say, "You're doing something brave." The waiting area was crowded. She took a seat by the window and watched the plane she'd be boarding being fueled and prepared. The gray metal shimmered under the Arizona sun. She imagined Gerald's voice, the way he wrote, calm, measured, hopeful. He didn't use emojis or exclamation points, but his words carried warmth. He had written, "I look forward to seeing you in person, Susan. I think kindness leaves a trail. You seem to have one behind you." It had made her smile when she first read it. She wanted that to be true. The flight was smooth, uneventful. She stared at the clouds until they blurred, then flipped through the airline magazine, pretending to be interested in top 10 golf destinations in the Midwest. Anything to keep the butterflies in her stomach from waking up. When the plane touched down in Phoenix, she gathered her things slowly. The air felt drier already, even inside the airport terminal. Susan took a moment to straighten her blouse, apply a light layer of lip balm, and smooth her skirt, just enough to feel presentable, but not desperate. She stepped off the jet bridge and scanned the small crowd gathered at arrivals. Her eyes flicked across signs, couples embracing, children squealing. She searched for a face she had only seen in profile photos. Tired eyes, kind smile, weathered but gentle. And then she saw him. He was standing near the pillar, arms crossed, not holding a sign. He was taller than she remembered. His shirt was pressed, tucked into khaki slacks. But his eyes never lifted. He was staring at her, but not in recognition. In judgment. Susan offered a small wave. He hesitated, then gave a nod. No smile. No warmth. Just a slow shake of the head. Then, without a word, he turned and walked away. She blinked, confused. Was he heading to meet her somewhere else? But then a young woman approached, mid-30s, professionally dressed, and asked, "Mrs. Bennet?" "Yes," Susan replied, her voice steady despite the sudden hollowness building in her chest. "I'm Mr. Martin's assistant. He asked me to deliver this." She handed Susan a small envelope. Inside was a one-line note, handwritten. "Apologies. You appear older than expected. This won't be a good fit." There was a crisp $20 bill folded with the note. For cab fare, presumably. Susan stared at it. Not in anger, not in embarrassment. Just a quiet disbelief. She thought she'd feel humiliated. She didn't. What she felt in that moment was confirmation. She folded the note slowly, tucked the money into her purse, and turned back toward the check-in counter. Back at the airport lounge, Susan sat by a window, her ticket back to Boston printed and trembling slightly in her hand. She hadn't cried. Not even when the assistant handed her that envelope. Perhaps it was pride. Perhaps the years had simply taught her how to absorb impact without showing the bruise. She took out her notebook. She stared at the page. Fall in love again. Then, beneath it, she wrote in small, even letters. Not with someone who cannot see me. She closed the notebook and breathed. The flight back was scheduled for late evening. The plane would be boarding in under 2 hours. Just enough time to find something warm to drink and sit in silence without feeling watched. But as she made her way to the gate, a small boy was crying near the bench, wild, inconsolable. His hands covered his ears. A man, worn and worried, was kneeling beside him, trying desperately to calm him. Susan didn't mean to stop, but she did. There was something in the boy's cry, sharp, panicked, familiar, and something in the man's face, exhausted, but kind. She watched from a distance, something in her beginning to stir. Not pity. Recognition. The boy's cries echoed sharply across the waiting area, slicing through the ambient hum of airport chatter like a violin string stretched too tight. Passengers shifted in their seats, annoyed, concerned, whispering just loud enough for the exhaustion in the father's eyes to deepen. He was crouched beside his son, one hand on the boy's small shoulder, the other rubbing tiredly at the back of his neck. The child, no older than 6, rocked slightly, covering his ears, his face flushed and scrunched into something between fear and frustration. "Max," the man said gently. "Hey, buddy. Breathe, just like we practiced, okay? In through the nose." But Max wasn't listening. The fluorescent lights, the boarding announcements, the crowd pressing in from every direction. It was too much. His father reached for a toy car from his bag, but Max knocked it away, trembling. A younger Susan might have looked away, not because she didn't care, but because she would have assumed it wasn't her place. But something about the boy's panic struck a deeper note in her chest. It reminded her of the classroom, the students who didn't know how to ask for help, who could only scream what their hearts didn't yet have words to say. And so, without thinking, she stepped forward. "Excuse me," she said softly. The man turned. He was in his early 40s, broad-shouldered, with dark circles under blue eyes that looked like they hadn't seen rest in weeks. "Look, I'm sorry," he began, already bracing for criticism. "I'm not here to complain," Susan interrupted gently. "I just might be able to help." He hesitated. "Unless you've got noise-canceling magic, I don't think anything's going to." But Susan was already reaching into her purse. She pulled out the small wooden flute, the one she always carried, not for performance, but as a reminder of joy, of the classroom she once filled with music and laughter, of a time before she forgot what her own voice sounded like. She knelt down slowly, eye level with Max. "Hi there," she said, her voice warm, unhurried. "This is my favorite instrument. It makes soft sounds, like the wind through trees." Max glanced at her, wary but curious. Susan extended the flute. "Would you like to try?" The boy didn't move. "It's okay if you don't," she said. "But if you hold it, I promise it won't make any scary noises. Just one breath. Just one note." The father, still crouched, still stunned, watched as Max slowly reached out and touched the flute. He brought it to his lips, tentatively. A single shaky note escaped, off-key, breathy. But the crying stopped. Passengers turned back to their phones. The tension in the air dissolved, as if someone had cracked a window open in a stuffy room. Max looked at Susan. She smiled. "See? You made music." The boy didn't answer, but he didn't let go of the flute either. The father exhaled a long breath, standing. "I don't know what you just did, but thank you." Susan stood too, brushing her skirt. "I didn't do anything. He just needed a different language." The man chuckled, then ran a hand through his hair. Logan West. Susan Bennett." He looked down at Max, who was still holding the flute like it was made of glass. "This little guy's Max. He's figuring out the world at his own pace." Susan nodded. "Aren't we all?" They didn't say much after that. The boarding call for their flight came over the speaker. "Row 17, Group B." "Looks like we're seatmates," Logan said, surprised. "We're in 17B and C." Susan blinked. "I'm 17A." They smiled at the same time. Once on board, Logan helped Max settle by the window, giving him the comfort of the view. Susan took the aisle. Logan sat between them. It was a tight fit, but it felt oddly right. Max leaned against the window, still holding the flute. Logan gave Susan a sidelong glance. "He hasn't stayed this calm on a plane in over a year." "I used to teach music," she said simply. "You still do," Logan replied, his voice low. "Even if you don't know it." That quiet acknowledgement stirred something in her. It had been years since someone saw her as more than just polite or invisible. Years since someone understood that music wasn't just about notes. It was about connection. Healing. As the plane lifted off, the city lights disappeared beneath clouds tinged with lavender and orange. Susan looked out the window, and for the first time in weeks, she didn't think about where she'd been rejected or who had walked away. She thought about Max's hands gripping that flute, about Logan's eyes, worn but kind, about how sometimes what's broken doesn't need to be fixed. It just needs to be understood. As the engines hummed and the cabin lights dimmed, Susan leaned back in her seat. She had been headed home, believing she was returning to the same life she'd always had. But maybe, just maybe, this was a different kind of journey. One that wasn't about going back, but moving forward. The first few minutes of the flight were surprisingly quiet. Not just calm, but quiet, in that rare and sacred way when a child who once cried can finally exhale. Max sat by the window, his face lit faintly by the moonlight glinting off the plane's wing. He still held the little wooden flute in both hands, like a fragile secret. Susan hadn't planned to speak again. She wasn't trying to be the miracle passenger. But in the hush that settled over row 17, something about the silence felt earned. Logan leaned back in his seat and glanced toward her, offering a small, tired smile. He usually melts down on flights like this. Loud places, unexpected changes. It's always a battle. Susan nodded slowly. He's sensitive to the world. That's not a flaw. It's just different wiring. He tilted his head, watching her carefully. "You've done this before?" "I've worked with children who didn't speak the way others do, but they still had something to say." Logan looked at Max, his eyes softening. His mom used to say the same thing. Susan didn't press. She had learned, with time, that the hardest stories always lived in the pauses. And Logan had a pause in his voice, one that lingered after the word, used to. They sat in a comfortable quiet for a while, broken only by the occasional ding of the seatbelt light or the rustle of magazines being flipped. Max didn't say a word, but he began blowing gently through the flute again. Random notes, some airy, some clear. The sounds had no melody, but they weren't noise. They were attempts. Susan watched him, quietly moved. "You know," she said softly, "when I was teaching, I used to tell my students that the first sound you make is never wrong. It's just the beginning." Logan turned toward her. "You really loved it, didn't you?" "Teaching." "I did. Until I didn't." He raised an eyebrow. Susan looked out the window for a moment. "My husband fell ill. Alzheimer's. It took him slowly. First his memories, then his music. Then the parts of him I didn't even know I'd miss until they were gone." Logan didn't respond right away. He didn't offer apologies or platitudes. He just nodded, his expression open and quiet. "He passed 6 weeks ago," she added. "I'm sorry," he said, and meant it. "It's all right," she replied. "I got to love him through every version of himself. That's not a burden. That's a gift." The plane dipped slightly as it began to level at cruising altitude. A light flickered above them. Max was now tapping the flute gently on his lap like a tiny drum. Logan smiled. "He's a percussion kid," Logan said, his voice gentler now. "Always has been. I used to be a drummer myself, back before life got complicated." Susan turned toward him, intrigued. "You played professionally?" "No, just bars. Local gigs. Until the Marines then. The beat sort of changed," she chuckled. "You know, you and I both sound like people who had lives that paused and forgot how to press play again." Logan considered that. "Yeah," he said after a moment. "Yeah, I think that's exactly right." They shared a look, quiet, searching, honest. Neither was trying to impress the other. They weren't flirting. They were simply seen. And for Susan, that was new. A short time later, a flight attendant approached with a kind smile. "Would your son like a juice box?" she asked Logan. Before Logan could respond, Max spoke, barely a whisper. "Apple." The flight attendant blinked. "Did he?" Logan's eyes welled up. "Yeah, he did." Susan didn't say a word. She just smiled and looked ahead, letting the boy have his moment. Letting Logan feel it, fully, deeply. When the flight attendants dimmed the cabin lights and most passengers settled in for the night, Logan folded his jacket into a makeshift pillow behind his head. Max had drifted to sleep, his head resting lightly on his father's arm. Susan reached into her purse and pulled out her notebook. She hadn't meant to open it in front of anyone, but her hand moved instinctively now, the way it always did when a moment refused to go unmarked. She turned to the familiar page, Things I Never Got to Do. Beneath the last entry, Fall in Love Again, she drew a single line, not to cross it out. Not yet, but to make space underneath. Then, in careful script, she wrote, Be seen. Truly seen. She glanced toward Logan and Max, two strangers who, in a matter of hours, had stirred something in her that hadn't moved in years. Not romance, not infatuation, just recognition. She capped her pen and leaned back. As the hum of the engine filled the air and the stars outside blinked in and out of sight through cloud cover, Susan felt something loosen in her chest. She wasn't flying back to where she'd been. She was flying toward where she might become. The sky outside had turned to velvet, deep blue stitched with stars, occasionally blurred by the soft trails of distant clouds. From 30,000 feet, the world below seemed too far to touch them, and for once, Susan was thankful for the distance. Max slept soundly, his head still nestled against Logan's arm. His small fingers, had finally released the flute, which now rested gently across his lap like a feathered promise. Between the hum of the engine and the soft breathing of the child, a quiet peace had settled over row 17. But inside Susan, something unfamiliar stirred. Not nervousness, not longing, just a sense that maybe, for the first time in a long time, she was in motion, not just physically, but inwardly. She looked over at Logan. He wasn't asleep. He stared straight ahead, posture relaxed, but eyes far away. She hesitated, then spoke in a voice barely louder than a whisper. "Tell me about her." Logan glanced at her, surprised, but not offended. "Max's mom?" Susan nodded. He exhaled slowly, as if the memory had weight. Her name was Dana. She was sunlight in a bottle, one of those people who could make a room feel better just by walking into it. We met in college. She was studying speech therapy. I was pretending to study engineering, but mostly playing drums in every dive bar that would pay in beer and fries. Susan smiled gently. We got married after I came back from my second deployment. Things were good. Simple. We had Max later than most. Doctors said it might never happen. But then, there he was. Our miracle. He paused. Susan didn't interrupt. When Max was 2, he continued, Dana started getting headaches. Nothing serious, we thought. Turned out it was a brain tumor. Aggressive. Unforgiving. She was gone within 8 months. Susan's breath caught. Logan's voice didn't break, but his grip on the armrest tightened. She wrote letters for Max, for birthdays, first days of school, his graduation. Stuff she knew she'd never get to see. I haven't opened them yet. I keep thinking, what if I'm not raising him the way she imagined? Susan reached out, not to touch, but just to close the space between their words. You're doing more than imagining, Logan. You're showing up. That's more than most children ever get. He looked at her then. Not just a glance, but a quiet study, like he was trying to understand something that didn't quite make sense. How do you do that? He asked. Do what? Make everything sound like it matters. Susan smiled, then looked back out the window. Because it does. A moment passed. Then Logan leaned forward slightly, lowering his voice. You said your husband had Alzheimer's. She nodded. George. We were married 34 years. What was that like? Susan's eyes didn't leave the stars. It was like watching a library slowly lose power. The lights went out, one by one. First he forgot where the forks were, then how to tie his shoes. Then, my name. Logan said nothing, but even in the final days, when words left him, when he didn't recognize our home, he'd still hum the melody of our wedding song when I played it on the piano. Music was the last light that stayed on. She turned to him, her expression clear, quiet. That's why I still carry that flute. Not because I need to play, but because someone might still need to hear something. Logan looked down at Max, asleep and steady. Well, he said, you definitely hit the right note today. Susan let out a soft laugh. Maybe we're just 2 broken instruments, making what music we can. They both sat back in their seats. A new kind of silence settled over them. Not awkward, not empty. Just shared. Somewhere over the Midwest, the captain announced they were beginning their descent. The cabin lights flicked on, casting a soft gold across passengers, rubbing sleep from their eyes. Max stirred, stretching. You okay, buddy? Logan asked, brushing hair from his son's forehead. Max nodded. Then, surprising both adults, he looked at Susan and said, Do you have more music? Susan blinked. It was the first time he'd spoken to her directly. She smiled and reached into her purse again. Not for the flute this time, but for a small, folded scrap of sheet music she always kept tucked in a side pocket. It was a simple lullaby, one she used to teach to her students on rainy days. She handed it to him. Max took it reverently, as if it were a treasure map. "Will you show me?" Susan looked at Logan, seeking permission. He nodded. So right there, in the final minutes of the flight, Susan began humming. Softly. Max followed with a few notes on the flute. Uncertain, squeaky, but joyful. And just like that, Row 17 became a music class in the sky. When the plane touched down and passengers began gathering their belongings, more than one person turned to smile at Susan. A man in a business suit gave her a thumbs up. A woman whispered, "Thank you." Logan stood and reached for the overhead compartment, pulling down their bags. Then he turned to Susan. "Same flight back?" he asked. Susan blinked. "I wasn't planning to return right away. My plans changed." He looked at her for a beat longer, then simply said, "I'm glad they did." She didn't know what to say, but she knew what she felt. And for the first time in a very long time, what she felt didn't scare her. The seatbelt light chimed softly as the captain's voice crackled overhead, announcing their descent into Boston. Outside, the stars were fading into a pale lavender sky, the very first whisper of dawn stretching its way across the horizon. Susan looked out the window, not so much to admire the view, but to gather herself. Something had shifted, not just in the altitude, but in the air between them. There was a warmth there now, unspoken, but certain. Beside her, Max was sitting upright and calm, the little wooden flute still in his lap, his thumb rubbing a groove into the worn grain like it was a worry stone. Logan sat with his hands clasped loosely between his knees, his face relaxed in a way it hadn't been when they first met. No one had said it, but they all felt it. This flight had turned into something more than transportation. It had become a moment suspended in time, a breath, a pause between who they had been and who they might be becoming. As the plane began its descent, the usual rustling began around them, seat backs returning upright, bags adjusted, strangers muttering about traffic and connections and coffee. But in row 17, no one rushed. Susan leaned forward slightly and said to Max, "Thank you for letting me play music with you." The boy looked up at her with wide, quiet eyes. Then, with a kind of deliberate courage only a child could summon, he reached across Logan's lap and took Susan's hand. Not grabbed it, not brushed it, just held it, gently, trustingly. Susan froze, not out of discomfort, but because she understood immediately what it meant. Children like Max didn't reach for people easily. They didn't do things just to be polite. Every gesture came from instinct, from truth. She met his gaze. "That means a lot to me, Max." The boy offered a small nod, then looked away, like it had taken everything in him to give that moment. Logan watched it all in silence, but his hand moved subtly to cover his mouth, and his shoulders lifted, just slightly, as if he were holding back a tide of emotion. When he spoke, his voice was quieter than usual. He's never done that before, not even with his teachers. Susan didn't respond. Her throat was tight with something too large for words. Gratitude, perhaps. Or awe. Maybe both. The wheels touched down with a soft thud. As the plane rolled across the tarmac, Susan felt the strange pull of reality trying to catch up. Her bag. Her ride. Her empty house in Vermont waiting like a paused record player. And yet, she wasn't the same woman who had boarded a different plane just 24 hours earlier, with a hopeful dress and a heart bracing for rejection. She had been left behind, but somewhere mid-flight, she'd been found. At the gate, passengers began filing out. Logan unbuckled Max, helping him with his tiny backpack. Then he looked at Susan. "Do you have someone picking you up?" "No," she said, brushing a strand of silver hair behind her ear. "I was just going to catch a shuttle to the train station." Logan paused, visibly weighing something. Then he asked, "Would you maybe let me give you a ride?" Susan hesitated, not out of fear. There was none of that with him, but out of instinct. She'd spent so long not being seen, not being asked. This was new, and it came from someone she trusted, even without understanding why. She smiled softly. Only if Max rides up front and controls the music. Logan grinned. That's a deal he's definitely going to accept. The walk to the baggage claim was slow and warm. Max held Susan's hand the entire way, occasionally swinging it like a pendulum, which made Susan laugh more freely than she had in months. Logan stayed close beside them, but never intrusive. The rhythm between the three of them felt natural, like they'd practiced it somewhere before. While they waited at the carousel, Logan broke the comfortable silence. "I have a crazy idea," he said. "Maybe too crazy." Susan raised an eyebrow. He rubbed the back of his neck, suddenly boyish. "Max and I are driving up to Vermont this weekend. There's an orchard festival just outside Montpelier. Apple picking, live music, bonfires. He loves it." "And your crazy idea?" Susan prompted gently. Logan met her eyes. "I was wondering if you might like to join us." Susan blinked. "This weekend? You don't have to decide now, or at all. He paused, and for the first time there was a flicker of nervousness in his voice. "I think Max really liked you, and I know I did." That last part wasn't flirtation. It was recognition. Susan took a breath, then another. Her hand brushed against her purse, where the notebook waited, its last page still blank. She nodded. "Maybe I'll think about it." Outside the terminal, a breeze swept past, tousling Max's hair and lifting the hem of Susan's coat. The sun had fully risen now, casting soft golden light across the city skyline. A new day, fresh and unfinished. As Logan pulled the car around, Max climbed into the front seat, clutching the flute. Susan stood beside the curb for a moment, letting the warmth of the moment settle into her bones. And just before stepping into the car, she looked up, just for a second, at the open sky. "Thank you," she whispered silently. "Not to a person, not even to God. Just to life, for finally sending her back not to who she used to be, but to someone she never imagined she still could become." The house was just as she had left it, still, tidy, and faintly scented with dried lavender and old wood. The kettle on the stove hadn't been used in weeks. The piano in the corner still sat closed, its keys untouched since the memorial service. Susan set her bag down gently by the door. No fanfare, no one waiting. Just the gentle hum of silence that greeted her like an old companion. She walked through the hallway, fingers trailing lightly against the wallpaper she and George had picked out 20 years ago, a pattern of faded wildflowers, the same path she had taken hundreds of times. And yet today, something felt different. She made tea, out of habit more than desire, and sat by the kitchen window overlooking the backyard. The maple tree outside was beginning to change color, its tips tinged with red and amber. Autumn was coming early this year. She cupped her hands around the warm mug and stared at the tree for a long time. Not in grief, in reflection. How strange it was to feel both heavy and light at once. Later that evening, after the sun had dropped behind the hills and the house had darkened into a soft hush, she opened her purse and pulled out the notebook. She hadn't touched it since the flight. She turned to the familiar page. Things I never got to do. Her eyes rested on the last few lines. She had drawn a line beneath "fall in love again" and added, "be seen, truly seen." And she had. Not by a stranger in Arizona, not by a man seeking youth in photos, but by a little boy with a wooden flute, and a father who listened when she spoke. She picked up her pen, hovering above the page, and wrote slowly, deliberately, "Let someone stay, even if I didn't ask them to." She closed the notebook softly, as if sealing something important inside it. The next morning, her phone buzzed. A message from an unknown number. But she knew who it was before she opened it. Logan West. I know this is forward, but Max keeps asking when we'll see you again. He says you're the music lady now. Susan smiled, warmth rising to her cheeks. Then another message came, seconds later. This is probably too much, but if you're free this weekend, we'd love to have you join us at the Orchard Festival. No pressure, just a hayride and some cider with a kid who thinks you're magic. She stared at the words, not because they were romantic. They weren't. They were true, earnest, simple in the way things are when they don't need embellishment. Susan set the phone down and stood, walking toward the coat closet. She pulled out her light fall jacket, the one she hadn't worn since George had passed. She checked the pockets, half expecting to find old tissues or hard candy wrappers. But instead, she found a folded slip of paper, a music program from her last recital. 5 years ago. The piece circled in red. Evening in Vermont, a duet for flute and piano. She'd chosen it for the students, for the quiet ones, the ones like Max. She held the paper for a moment, then looked toward the old upright piano in the corner. She hadn't touched it in months, but now she sat down, lifted the cover, and placed her hands on the keys. The first few notes were rusty, uncertain, but then muscle memory took over. And when the melody unfolded, it wasn't just music, it was a remembering of who she had been and who she might still be. That Saturday, Susan stood at the edge of the orchard in a soft wool sweater, scarf knotted loosely at her neck. The Vermont sky was high and blue, the trees full of fruit and color. She spotted them instantly. Max, in a red flannel jacket, was tugging on Logan's sleeve and pointing toward her, beaming. Logan smiled. He looked like he hadn't slept much, but he also looked like a man who was trying. And in trying, he was becoming something more. They walked toward her. No grand entrances, no declarations, just Max holding out a paper cup of warm cider like it was a medal of honor. "This one's for you," he said. Susan took it with both hands. "Thank you, sweetheart." Logan gave a sheepish grin. "We saved you a spot on the hayride? Max insisted." "I wouldn't dare disappoint him," she said with a wink. They walked side by side toward the wagon, Max skipping slightly ahead. As they approached, Logan said quietly, "You didn't have to come." "I know," Susan replied, "but I wanted to." They didn't need to say more, because sometimes the most important journeys aren't marked by distance, but by choice. That night, back at home, Susan opened her notebook once more. The last page still had room. She picked up her pen. Go where kindness lives, even if it means starting over. Then she turned to the front cover, and, in soft ink just beneath the old title, "Things I Never Got to Do," she wrote a new one. Things I didn't expect, but was brave enough to say yes to. She closed the book, smiling, and this time she didn't put it away. She left it out. Because maybe the story wasn't done being written. 3 days had passed since the Orchard Festival, but Susan could still feel the crispness of the air on her cheeks, the faint stickiness of warm cider on her fingertips, and the quiet joy of Max leaning against her arm during the hayride, his head gently bumping her shoulder as he giggled at the bumps in the dirt path. It had been the first time in years that she had laughed so easily, not the polite laugh people use to fill silence, but the kind that bubbles up from somewhere deep, surprising even herself. She'd returned to her house that night and found it changed. Not physically, but something about it felt different, less like a tomb. More like a home she might actually walk into rather than through. The next morning, she cleaned the guest room, not because she expected anyone to visit, but because, for the first time in a long time, she wanted to make space for something, or someone, not yet here. That Thursday afternoon, she was in the kitchen kneading bread dough when a soft knock echoed from the front door. She paused. She wasn't expecting mail or deliveries. Most of her neighbors texted if they were dropping something off. She wiped her hands, untied her apron, and opened the door. Logan stood on her porch, holding a paper bag in one hand and Max's backpack in the other. Susan blinked. "Well, this is unexpected." Logan gave a sheepish grin. "I come bearing apologies. And stew." She stepped aside, waving him in. "You're lucky I like both." The kitchen filled with the smell of rosemary and roasted vegetables as Logan unpacked the contents of the bag. Mason jars of homemade stew, 2 crusty rolls, and a folded napkin with Max's name scribbled across it in crayon. "I didn't know you cooked," Susan said as she set 2 bowls on the table. "Survival skill," Logan replied. "Max is picky. He won't touch anything that smells like a vegetable unless I disguise it with heroic amounts of broth and patience." Susan laughed. "Sounds like most adults I know." They sat. The stew was good, earthy, warming, made with care. Susan took her time with each bite, savoring the texture, the silence, the strange and lovely ease that came with sharing a simple meal with someone whose presence didn't ask anything of her. "So," she said gently, "what's the occasion?" Logan hesitated. "I guess. I wanted to say thank you, not just for the festival, but for that flight, for showing up when I didn't know I needed someone to." Susan tilted her head. "And Max?" Logan's eyes softened. "He's been humming that little tune you showed him all week. Started trying to play it on the piano at his therapy sessions. The therapist said he's more open than she's ever seen." Susan's hand paused midair, the spoon between her fingers trembling slightly. "That's wonderful." "It's more than that," Logan said. "It's you. You reached him." Susan looked down at her bowl, the weight of those words settling over her shoulders, not as a burden, but as a balm. She had spent so long wondering if she still had anything left to offer. But maybe all she needed was someone willing to let her try. After lunch, Logan stood to leave. "We won't stay long. I didn't want to intrude." Susan hesitated, then asked, "Where's Max?" "In the truck. He fell asleep on the way. We were coming back from an appointment in Montpellier. I almost didn't stop, but I didn't want to miss the chance." Susan nodded. Then, after a pause, said, "Bring him in. The guest room's ready. If he needs to nap, he's welcome." Logan looked at her, really looked, and something shifted in his expression, a kind of gratitude that couldn't be spoken. He returned 5 minutes later with Max cradled in his arms, sound asleep, clutching the wooden flute like a stuffed animal. Susan led them down the hallway. "He can rest in here." Logan laid the boy gently onto the bed. Max stirred but didn't wake. Susan knelt beside the bed and gently adjusted the blanket over him. She didn't need to be told that this was a moment, the sound of a child's breath, the peace of a safe place. The quiet understanding that sometimes home isn't where you live, it's where someone is glad you showed up. Back in the kitchen, Susan poured tea while Logan leaned against the counter, his posture looser than usual. "Did you ever think life would look like this?" he asked. Susan smiled wryly. "No. I thought I'd be alone by now, reading mystery novels in a rocking chair with no one but a cat to talk to." "Do you want it to look like this?" he asked carefully. She set the mug down and looked at him. Her eyes, as always, were clear. "I don't know what it is yet, Logan, but I know it feels worth staying curious about." He smiled. Not wide, not showy, just real. "That's good enough for me." An hour later, Logan gently woke Max and helped him to the truck. Susan walked them to the porch. Before leaving, Max turned and held out the flute to her. She blinked. "Are you sure?" He nodded. "I want you to keep it until we make more music." Logan mouthed, "Wow," and laughed softly. That's his version of a proposal. Susan's heart swelled, full of something that had no name but felt like hope. "Tell him," she said to Logan. "I accept." As the truck pulled away and the gravel crunched beneath the tires, Susan stood at the edge of the porch, holding the flute in both hands. And for the first time in years, she didn't feel like someone waiting for life to happen. She felt like someone it had already found. The orchard was quiet this time of year. The last of the apples had been picked. The tourists had gone. The trees stood bare and stoic, their skeletal branches etched against the gray October sky, like the careful brushstrokes of a winter painting yet to dry. Susan stood between two rows of trees, her boots sunk lightly into the soft earth. In her hands was the wooden flute, cleaned, polished, and warm from her touch. She raised it slowly to her lips and played a soft, slow tune that drifted across the rows like smoke from a chimney. Not for performance, not for praise, just because it was morning, and she was alive, and something inside her needed to breathe through sound. Max was chasing leaves up ahead, his laugh echoing like a bell every time the wind helped him. Logan stood not far behind, one hand in his pocket, the other holding a thermos of coffee. He watched them both as if trying to memorize the moment, just in case life decided to take it back too soon. Susan lowered the flute. "You okay back there?" "I'm afraid if I blink, I'll wake up," Logan said. She smiled, brushing a silver strand of hair from her cheek. "I promise, you're not dreaming. I bake too well to be a dream." He chuckled, walked forward, and handed her the thermos. "This is the best Saturday I've had in years." "It's Tuesday." "Exactly." They stood in silence for a few seconds, watching Max tumble into a pile of leaves, arms wide, joy unfiltered. Susan took a slow sip of the coffee. Logan made it just the way she liked it now. Strong, but not bitter. A little almond milk, 2 spoonfuls of honey. Not because she told him, because he remembered. "I've been thinking," Logan said finally, eyes still on Max. "Maybe we should try that duet sometime." Susan turned to him, surprised. "You mean, the one from the recital program?" He nodded. "Evening in Vermont." She softened. "You remember the title?" "I remember how you looked at it." She looked down at the flute in her hand. "It's for piano and flute." "I know," he said. "And Max has already claimed he'll be our audience of one." Susan felt something press at the edge of her chest, gentle but insistent. A part of her had started believing this might just be a passing season. A warm wind before winter. A sweet interlude before returning to solitude. But Logan was standing beside her, steady and real. And nothing about this felt temporary. Later, back at Susan's house, they gathered in the living room. The fireplace crackled softly, filling the space with a gentle warmth. Max lay on the rug with colored pencils, drawing something that looked like trees, clouds, and a small stick figure playing a flute. Susan sat on the piano bench, flipping through an old music binder. She stopped at Evening in Vermont and set it on the stand. Logan took the chair beside her. "Ready to embarrass ourselves?" "Always," she said with a grin. The first notes were rough, his rhythm hesitant, her timing off. But neither laughed. They leaned in, adjusted, listened more carefully. By the third try, the melody had settled into place, tentative, but clear, like a road discovered under fresh snow. Max looked up from his drawing and watched quietly, his head tilted slightly to one side. When they finished the piece, he clapped twice, then nodded in solemn approval. "That's his way of saying, 'You passed,'" Logan whispered. "I'll take it." After Max was asleep upstairs, tucked in the guest bed again, clutching a new stuffed owl Susan had found in the attic, Logan lingered by the fire. Susan poured 2 mugs of chamomile tea and handed him one. He held the warm mug but didn't drink. "I need to ask you something." She sat on the couch across from him. "Go on." "I've been doing this alone for a long time, and I'm not bad at it, but I'm tired. Not just physically. Soul tired. Susan listened, steady. I don't want to rush anything, and I don't expect answers tonight. But if there's even a part of you that wants to stay in this, whatever this is becoming, I want you to know I'd make room. Susan stared at him for a long moment, not because she was unsure, but because no one had offered her room in so long. Not space to be useful, not space to fill silence, but space to belong. She set her mug down, walked across the room, and sat beside him. Not too close. Just enough. I've spent years waiting for someone to see me without needing to be fixed, she said. You do that. He looked down. You make this house feel like home, not because you clean it, because you fill it. Then, in the quiet, she reached for his hand. It was rough, warm, honest. They didn't kiss. They didn't have to. Sometimes the loudest declarations are made in silence. That night, as the fire dimmed and the wind picked up outside, Susan opened her notebook one last time before bed. At the very bottom of the page, beneath every line she had written about things she never got to do, she added, "Play music again, with someone who made the silence feel safe." She closed the notebook, turned off the light, and for the first time in years, she slept through the night, without dreams of what she'd lost. Only the soft, lingering hum of what she'd just begun. It started with a letter. Not handwritten, not poetic. Just a short email from Logan that arrived one morning between a grocery list and a local library newsletter. Thinking about a picnic this Sunday. Maybe just you, me, and Max. Backyard, cider, music. Nothing fancy. Unless you say yes to something fancier. Susan had read it twice, then a third time. She smiled. Not because it was a proposal, but because it wasn't. There were no promises she hadn't asked for, no speeches rehearsed in front of mirrors. Just a man who meant what he said, and a child who saw her not as a visitor, but as a piece of home. She didn't reply right away. Instead, she went upstairs to her closet and pulled out the dress she'd packed for Arizona. The soft blue one with the tiny white flowers. The one that had once felt like a symbol of foolish hope. She held it up to the light. And this time, it didn't look foolish at all. The backyard that Sunday was nothing extraordinary. An old oak tree in the center, a table set with chipped plates and homemade food, and Max running barefoot across the grass, dragging a red ribbon behind him. But to Susan, it was the most beautiful place she had ever seen. Logan wore a button-down shirt, still slightly wrinkled, sleeves rolled up to his elbows, and met her at the gate with a cup of hot cider and a look in his eyes that didn't need translation. "You came," he said softly. "I never left," she replied. Max had decorated the tree with paper leaves, each one with something he loved written in crayon. Daddy, flute, Susan, pancakes, trees, quiet. They laughed together as he showed off his list, then settled on a blanket beneath the branches. There were no guests, no music cues, no bouquet. But there was Logan, holding Susan's hand, while Max giggled beside them, and there was a gentle breeze that made the leaves whisper above their heads. Logan cleared his throat. "I had a speech," he said. "I forgot it." Susan smiled. "Good. I've always liked improvisation better." He looked at her for a long moment, as if steadying himself. "I don't want perfect. I don't need promises you can't keep. I just want what's real. The way you listen, the way you show up, the way Max feels safe when you're around." Susan blinked back tears. "And I want the way you don't ask me to be anything but who I already am." Logan reached into his pocket and pulled out 2 simple silver rings. No diamonds, no boxes, just the kind of bands that could be worn during a hayride or while kneading bread or playing piano. He slipped one onto her finger. She did the same. Max clapped once, then stood and placed the flute in Susan's lap like it was a sacred offering. "You have to play now," he said solemnly. Susan laughed through her tears and raised the flute to her lips. She played the tune they'd played that night, Evening in Vermont, this time slower, fuller, with every note soaked in memory and meaning. Logan joined her on the small, portable keyboard they'd brought outside, his chords tentative at first, then steady. And there, under a canopy of paper leaves and late autumn sky, the three of them made music together. Not perfectly, but truthfully. It wasn't a wedding with vows and lace, but it was a beginning. That night, as the stars pricked the sky and Max slept curled between his two favorite blankets upstairs, Logan and Susan sat on the porch swing, wrapped in the same knit throw, fingers intertwined. "You know," Susan said, "I used to think starting over meant building something entirely new, tearing down everything old. And now?" She looked up at the stars, their quiet light scattered across the vastness. "Now, I think it means taking what's left and choosing to see it as enough." Logan nodded. "You're more than enough, Susan." They didn't kiss. Not yet. But there was a closeness that made the gesture unnecessary, because in that silence, every question had already been answered. Later that night, before going to bed, Susan opened her notebook for what she thought would be the final time. She turned to the last page, beneath all the entries, and added, "Say yes to a love that asks nothing but your presence." She paused. Then, in smaller handwriting, "Wear the dress, only this time, for the right reasons." She closed the notebook, not with finality, but with the feeling one has after placing the last piece in a long, complex puzzle. Not every space had been filled the way she expected, but the picture now made perfect sense. Winter came quietly to Vermont. The first snowfall arrived like a soft sigh, blanketing the hills and rooftops in hush-white stillness. The orchard trees, once golden with apples, now stood bare beneath frost-laced skies. Inside the house on Chestnut Lane, the fireplace glowed low, casting amber light across the wooden floors. Susan stood at the window in her wool socks, a mug of spiced tea warming her palms. Behind her, laughter rose from the living room where Max was building a pillow fort, and Logan, hopelessly outnumbered by the child's imagination, was trying to negotiate terms of surrender. Susan smiled, not because it was perfect, but because it was theirs. It had been 3 months since the backyard wedding that wasn't quite a wedding. The days that followed unfolded slowly, gently. There had been no rush to define things, no urgency to explain. Susan still had her own room, her own space, her own name. But everything else, the dinners, the bedtime stories, the morning cups of coffee left steaming beside her notebook, was shared. She and Logan found rhythm, not routine. They still had their separate fears, their quiet griefs, but they carried them together now, like two musicians keeping time for each other through a long piece. As for Max, he had blossomed. His speech was still sporadic, his social interactions selective. But the flute never left his side. He played it on walks, in the bath, and once, memorably, at a church potluck, earning a standing ovation he didn't quite understand. His therapist reported new words, more eye contact, more trust. But Susan didn't need reports. She could see it, feel it. Every time he climbed into her lap without asking, every time he tucked a drawing into her coat pocket, every time he reached for her hand at night, just to know she was there. One evening in mid-December, Logan found Susan at the piano, humming softly, flipping through a folder of old sheet music. "You thinking of teaching again?" he asked, leaning against the doorframe. She looked up, startled, but not defensive. "Maybe. There's a community center that runs weekend music workshops for kids. I thought, maybe Max would like to come, and some other children who need music the way I did." He walked over, placed his hands on her shoulders, and kissed the top of her head. "That's a beautiful idea." She tilted her head back slightly, smiling. "Do you ever feel like you ended up in a life you didn't expect?" Logan nodded. "Every day. And yet," she continued, eyes gleaming, "it feels like the only one that makes sense." That night, after Max had gone to bed, tired from a day of sledding and hot cocoa, Susan sat at the small desk near the front window. Snow was falling in slow spirals beyond the glass, like stars finding their way to Earth. She opened the notebook one last time, the one that had followed her from grief to hope, from an airport terminal to an orchard filled with music and paper leaves. She turned to the last blank page, and there, in careful script, she wrote, "Be loved not for what I could give, or fix, or sacrifice, but simply for who I am, here, now, enough." Then, beneath it, she added, "Let myself belong." Susan stared at the page for a long while. She didn't cry. She didn't smile. She just breathed. Fully. Deeply. As if for the first time in years, she had nothing left to prove. In the morning, she found Logan and Max at the kitchen table, building a snowman out of marshmallows and toothpicks. Max looked up and said, "Can we play music today?" "Of course we can," Susan replied, already reaching for the flute. Logan handed her a mug of coffee. "Almond milk, 2 honeys, exactly right." Outside, the world was white and wide and open, and in a small home tucked between the trees, a woman who once believed her story had ended found herself living in the middle of a brand new chapter, written not in longing, but in presence. The notebook was closed, not as an ending, but as a beginning. Sometimes, the greatest love stories don't begin with fireworks. They begin with silence, with a seat assignment, with a small act of kindness passed across an airplane aisle. And sometimes, all it takes is one person who stays. If this story touched your heart, even just a little, we invite you to stay with us a little longer. Subscribe to Soul Moment Story for more tales that celebrate love, resilience, and the quiet power of being seen. Because the world may be loud, but the most beautiful stories often begin in a whisper.